Testing 1, 2, 3, 4. It's an interview with Nathan Dean on October 2nd, 1989. Testing. Interview with Nathan Dean on October 2nd, 1989. Senator Dean, before we discuss the legislature, would you tell us a little bit about your family background and formative years?
Dr. Cook, my mother and father both worked in the Goodyear Mill. I was born on Wingfoot Street in the Goodyear Village, attended Goodyear School, graduated from Rockmart High School, spent 2 years in the Army, and went to Shorter College, and ran for the Rockmart City Council and been in politics ever since. I was at that time the youngest member of the City Council ever elected in the city of Rockmart. Then I ran for the House and served 12 years in the House, and I'm now completing at the end of this term will be 16 years in the Georgia Senate. Mm-hmm. Married and have 2 sons. Alan finished at Auburn University in 1988. Scott, my youngest son, will complete his education at Shorter College at the end of this semester in '89, Christmas of '89. Mm-hmm.
Had anyone in your family been in politics before?
No. At that time, it wasn't a lot of time to give, as far as my father was concerned. And he came here when Goodyear came. He came to work on the mill and to build the mill and to make the structure. And once it was completed, he, like many others in the Goodyear Village, just stayed. And he came from the farm, he and my mother both. And I have 5 sisters and a brother, all born here in Rockmart, and none live in Rockmart now with the exception of me. I was the baby of the 7. But no politics involved in my family other than voting until this generation came along.
How do you define your political philosophy?
Moderate to conservative, and I'll be frank with you, oftentimes I find myself not being able to say where I am conservative, ultra-conservative, moderate, or sometimes progressive, sometimes moderate on various issues. In people-orientated issues, I am moderate more than others, but as most Southerners have a conservative more on a national issue view than I do on a state issue view. For the issues nationally, I think sometimes tend to be more conservative for the nation than they do in the state of Georgia on a statewide basis. But I'm from conservative to moderate, but very progressive on issues that relates to senior citizens and young people in education more than any others.
All right. You got into politics at a very early age. What made you decide to run for the legislature?
I saw something that needed to be done, and I wanted to be a part of it. I saw a group of people not being represented. I saw a county not being represented. I read in the paper of things that were happening, and as a member of the Rockmart City Council, I saw that we were not receiving our share, the city's share of those things that I knew that other people were. By going to the Municipal Association meetings and by going to Atlanta to the Capitol with members of the Municipal Association, I saw that Rockmart per se was not receiving what she should, and nor did we apparently seem to have anybody that cared. And I thought that, if somebody else is not going to do it, why not try it myself? And I offered for the General Assembly and as a member of the City Council, and continued to serve both for at least 2 years. And then I did not run for the City Council again, but I served in the House and as a member of the City Council for 1 term. And I began then trying to bring back to Polk County, I thought that our fair share of what other areas were getting, and I knew they were getting them, particularly in South Georgia at that time. It was more dominance then than it is today. But I wanted to make sure that we got things that nobody else was getting.
I've been told that in your first race for the legislature, you rode around on a bicycle going door-to-door campaigning.
That's correct. Yes, sir. I had to have something that was catching. I knew I didn't have time to canvass and to see everybody in Polk County, even though I was trying to. It was different then. Most of the campaign you did yourself. You didn't have grassroots, and you didn't have people willing to put up signs because there were not that many signs. In fact, the first cards I gave out and the first brochures I gave out in my first election all were handmade and homemade at the business class here in Rockmart. I guess the superintendent of schools would charge me for them if he knew how many we ran off on his copying machine after hours with one of the instructors there who was very dear to me and helped me a tremendous amount the first time. So I go to Cedartown every morning, and a friend of mine allowed me to keep a bicycle there at the old A1, Mr. Buck Williams, and I keep, he would open every morning at 5 or 6 o'clock, and I'd be there if I wanted to catch a meal gate at 6 or what time. I'd get my bicycle, and I had an old Atlanta Journal paper route carrier type bag, and I had it strapped to the handlebars, and I filled it full of cards, and I'd catch a meal gate and ride through the village or ride wherever I wanted to go. But I canvassed this area on a bicycle the first time I ran, and it had to suffice one of two things. And I made the decision that everybody would laugh at it and thought it was clowning, or either they would take it as I wanted them to take it, be serious, and I was very serious in what I was attempting to do, and say, hey, you know, he's hard working, I want to help him. And it worked, but I had to make one of those two decisions. That you either laugh at me and think I'm clowning and forget about me, or either you think I'm serious and support me. And that helped. That really helped. In Cedartown, the only people I knew at Cedartown at that time were the municipal officials, and I knew people I'd played football against. I'd played football against Cedartown, baseball and basketball, and I had a lot of friends there, but that constituted a vast minority of people, you know, who participate in athletics. That's all I knew in Cedartown, so it worked. People still talk to me today about where's my bicycle, and that was 28 years ago.
Well, you've been reelected every time since then. Have you ever had real strong opposition?
Well, every opposition must be taken as strong opposition. You look, history will tell you those that did not take it as strong opposition. I have been told through the years that Mr. Talmadge always wanted some type of opposition for several reasons. Number one, it got him back home, and number two, it gave him a chance to enlist once again his contributions and fulfill pledges of replenishing his stock. And he always wanted some type of minor opposition. Well, he received that the last time, and it wasn't as minor as he thought it was. So when you start taking opposition as minor, and when you start taking it as well, this is token, you got a problem. For notably, the people that time may not hold it against you. But then when you do have what they think is stronger opposition, they'll remember the preceding election and say, well, he thought he had it made this time. We'll see how much he's got it made. And it can hurt you 2 years from now if it don't hurt you against the candidate. So I've had opposition. I've always looked upon opposition as strong, and makes me work that much harder. I've never taken any opposition lightly.
I know you campaigned very vigorously, but I don't recall any close elections. Seems to me you've won rather handily each time.
Well, I can thank the people for that, and maybe they like the fact that I don't take it lightly. I campaigned just as hard. We put up more signs and did more yard work and more local neighborhood policy work, and that's what you're coming to now. Elections now oftentimes are won under neighborhood type elections and campaigning more than ever before. Neighborhoods are becoming involved. I think you'll see tomorrow in the city election of Atlanta, of the seats that they have available under the city council, I think about 6 or 7 of them can and will be determined by the power of the neighborhoods. And we did that this last time more than we ever have before. We set up precincts, we set up neighborhood campaign, we set up neighborhood campaign watches, we put signs and literature in neighborhoods that before we've never done that. We just visit a street and go. But last time and it paid off. We made many new friends, and because the constituency changes. Everybody don't live on the same corner they did 10 years ago, and new ones move in and move out, but we worked hard at it this last time.
Since you've served in the General Assembly continuously since 1963, you must have observed and indeed been a part of some major political changes in Georgia's history. In your judgment, what has been the biggest change in the General Assembly in that period of time?
One of the biggest changes from our standpoint is that the power is beginning to sweep from the south to the north. The north is, we've always had the people, but we've never had the politics. The governors have always come from South Georgia, and Carl Sanders was the first one to break that. He came from Augusta, but Augusta is not classified as deep South Georgia. And Zell Miller came from the mountains. George Busby came from Albany, but he had strong ties in the Atlanta community that carried him forward as a workhorse and not a show horse, and he repaid North Georgia. In the politics of the reapportionments, but the greatest of these has been in 1962-63 when the court struck down the old county unit system of the state senate and was under the rotating system and kept it to wherever the individual lived. He could serve as long as the constituency allowed him. Prior to that, you ran from this county this term, next county, the next county, and they struck that down, and that was a step forward for the people and not the old county unit politics as had been administered for years and years under Gene Talmadge and his regime administration. But the shifting of the power and the reapportionment in 91 is even going to do more so. We'll gain another congressman. He'll be from North Georgia. Possibilities we may gain two. We know now we'll gain one. Now there's a possibility that two counties, Cobb and Gwinnett County, could pick up 4 to 6 House members. That also will enrich the Republican side of the scale. For both of those now dominant in that partisan area. But we'll pick up a couple of senators, and all these will be up, where the population is. It'll be up north. But the north part of the state being represented more than it ever has before has been a major factor. That and the changing of the guard as far as education is concerned, we're becoming more inclined to know that money must be spent on education. And that came in with Carl Sanders and will go out with Joe Frank Harris. Education and spending the money on education.
Do you think the members of the legislature are better qualified now than they were 25 years ago?
Yes, sir. I do. 25 years ago, a great number of legislators, a vast number, particularly from South Georgia, were farmers. And not that farmers aren't educated people, but they cannot turn loose and leave any time they want to. They had cotton to pick or wheat to plant or to reap or whatever. Today, the members of the General Assembly are business orientated. They're either attorneys or in some type of business. Even those that are farmers now are not farmers. They're in agribusiness, which is a $17 billion business in the state of Georgia, and it supplies a fourth of the workforce of the state. But they're more educated. More of them have degrees. More of them have some college. More of them are professionals than ever before, and it's not just a part-time job as it was 25 years ago. You went and spent 40 days and came home, and that's the last of it. You were only paid for that 40 days. You were not paid any more the rest of the year. On the last day of the session, on your 40th day, the clerk or the treasurer brought you a check, and you were paid for that 40 days, and that was it. You're not paid much more than that now, but at least it's incumbent upon you that you must be ready and available to spend 365 days a year if you're to represent you folks and if you're to bring home that which other people are bringing home, and that's part of the pie. You can't do it in 40 days. And the people there now are more educated. They're more professional. Most of them own their own business, or they have a degree in something that enables them to leave, druggists, attorneys, or some educators, but most of them have their own business, from insurance on to clothing and etc.
Your district is basically a rural area, and many people see the government as being divided between a rural and an urban camp. Yet you mentioned a north-south division. Is there a rural-urban conflict within the legislature?
Oh yes, and it's maybe the conflict is a misnomer, but it's readily available, whatever it may happen to be on that particular issue, whether it's rural or whether it's urban. And today, even to magnify that issue, is that most of the urban areas of Georgia are becoming even Republican. And that magnifies it even more, because now you've got philosophy involved in it, and you got a partisan basis encampment on the issues. But there's a division there between the rural and the urban. There's those in the South Georgia, and I say deep South Georgia, that will stay away from metropolitan areas and will oftentimes trade out. And trade out now is a secret that we didn't have 25 years ago. Because 25 years ago, the south part of the state did not have to trade. But today they have to trade because 25 years ago, Fulton County had 3 members of the House. 25 years ago, DeKalb County had 2 members of the House, and Cobb County had 2. So they didn't have to trade. But today, with Fulton County with 26 or 27 members of the House and DeKalb County with 20, 22, they must trade to win. And so they've learned to live with each other, whether they like it or not. They've learned to trade their bill on excess timber tax or elimination of timber tax or capital gains on timber tax with more roads for metropolitan area or more money for welfare for metropolitan area, whatever the issue may happen to be, or more schools for metropolitan. So they've learned to live with each other and tolerantly, and they've learned to live with each other because they're not to trade with each other. And what has happened, you have some people that are putting together a coalition of all of these, as has the Speaker of the present House, who served as Speaker longer than any other Speaker in our history. And that's been one of his successes, is he's put together a coalition of the urban and the rural and maintained. Prior to Tom Murphy, all you had to be was from South Georgia, and you could have maintained, you could have been Speaker. For the change in the times and reapportionment and the gaining of the strength of the urban areas, they don't have it completely. The 91 election may give the urban areas more strength than they ever know what to do with. So far, they didn't know what to do with it if they had it, because they'd never been in control before, and they went as factionalisms. They went in 20 different directions because they did not have a urban leader. So they united behind somebody else that could promise them the most, and that's been Mr. Murphy's great success, in that he's kept that coalition together, urban and rural. But the 90 census may unify even more, and the 91 election will not only put in a great number more urban votes and Republican votes, but it'll still be urban regardless of the party affiliation. But that's there. The old me versus you is not there. You have South Georgia boys going out 25 years ago. They didn't even run around together. They didn't go out to eat together. There was no closeness. But they're all friends now. It takes everybody. And they're closer together with their trades than they've ever been before.
In your judgment, is legislation based primarily on personal relationships or trade-outs, as you mentioned, or on real political convictions?
Some of both, mostly trade-outs. You have some people in the General Assembly that are absolutely devoted to a conviction, will fight for it, speak for it, vote against anything else, and stay there with that conviction every day. Oftentimes it's very hard for them to pass a piece of legislation. You may be one of the vast minority, one of 5 or 6 that have that conviction. So if you don't learn to trade that conviction, and there's nothing wrong with that. If you don't learn to trade some of your sensitivity for somebody else's sensitivity, I may have a strong conviction in one area and only have 7 people that agree with me. I'll never get it passed with 8 of us. But if I can trade some of my sensitivity, it may have to be downward. I may have to curtail some of that which I really believe in to get some of it through. Such as a social service for substance abuse programs. Everybody in this state do not believe that we ought to treat substance abuse people professionally. They believe we ought to put them in jail and lock the door and throw the key away. And that's their ultimate belief. And, they like to think of themselves as being very ultra conservative in their mannerism. But, somewhere you've got to treat some of these people. If you can treat them for 90 days and make a better productive citizen out of it, and that's your philosophy and that's your deep belief. But you can't win unless this gentleman who is very much opposed to you is convinced. And sometimes to convince him, you must trade. He wants more money for the highway department, so you vote to give him another $2 million, or you vote to do something else for his area and natural resources. Give some money to the Game and Fish to buy some property to set up more hunting areas, because as a conservative he's in that field. And then he votes with you to give you some more money to open up a substance abuse center or whatever you have, or more money for education. And it's a trade-off, and there's nothing wrong. That's government. If you stay 20 years down there and have one belief and will not feign and will not give up on that one belief and spend 20 years and never get anything done with it, you will have wasted 20 years of thinking and 20 years of belief. It's that person who can trade some of it, maybe sacrifice a small amount of it, but at least he's done something that he would have never done if he hadn't sacrificed some of his beliefs. And there's nothing wrong with that. And traded some of his beliefs.
So you're saying compromise?
Compromise is the word.
Pragmatism
That's right.
is the rule.
That's correct. And that's how legislation's passed. If a piece of legislation is introduced and 56 members of the Senate believe verbatim, identically every word in that legislation, something's wrong. You know, somebody's got to have a disagreement on 10 to 8 or 8 to 6 or 6 to 14 or $1 million rather than 500,000. But the ultimate end is we pass something that's pleasing to everybody, and each person represents a segment of the population. Thus, you've got 6.5 million Georgians that got a bill that they at least had a part of because their senator supported it from their district.
Have you ever had occasion when the majority of the people in your district favored a certain issue, but you felt differently? You sided with the minority. I doubt that that's come up very often, but has that situation ever occurred?
I can
If
give
so,
you one.
How do you deal with it?
I can give you one in just the opposite, and that's the lottery. That's just the opposite, though, of the minority. The vast majority of the people I hear from on the streets, from the one segment of the population, is anti-lottery. But my mail, where people can't hear it, is confidentially to me, is overwhelmingly for it. Every poll I've ever taken is overwhelmingly for it. But this same group of people within a group or within a crowd or on the streets won't mention to me lottery, won't vote for lottery. But my mail overwhelmingly last year, for the past 3 years, indicated in excess of 75 to 82% of all my correspondence, including 3 polls that I placed in the paper 3 years in a row, all indicated that lottery was the choice, at least the right to vote on it. But yet that's not what I hear when I visit with groups. I'll hear one say, you know, I oppose lottery, and the 3 sitting next to that person won't say, I'm for it. But I've received communications from all 3 of them saying, vote for lottery. I think it's time we at least got a chance to vote for it. So this is the case where the silent majority has been, or the silent group has been overwhelming the majority instead of the opposite.
Given that situation, how do you represent the district?
I voted to give the people the last time, the people the right to vote on the lottery issue. And I came back and I was confronted with it, and I showed them polls, and I explained to them that overwhelming 75% plus of the people had talked to me about tying lottery, doing something about lottery and doing something with education, and I had an opportunity to tie the two together. Tax rebates, tax reformation, and education, and I voted for it under those circumstances, or at least I voted to give them the right to express their opinion on the issue.
I would imagine the abortion issue will be a controversial one coming up.
It's a no-win situation, and we can get into that. That's in the future. In your question you asked in the past, but another one will be abortion for the future. It's a no-win situation. Roe versus Wade, I would imagine 50 state General Assemblies wish went away. I think 50 state General Assemblies hope that the court, which convenes today for another sitting, will make a decision. We hope that our Ms. Day, the Supreme Court jurist, the lady, Sandra O'Connor, will this time take a positive step. You know, there was rumors and newspaper articles last time that she wanted to, but she did not want to be recognized in history as by the women as the woman that made the ultimate decision that broke the tie, even though she came close to it on 2 other votes. There's 50 states hoping, particularly those that run for office in the higher plane in Georgia, hope that a decision will be made this October term of court that will preempt them from having to make a decision in January. But it's going to be a no-win situation.
Do you have any feeling about how your district believes on that issue?
No, I'm getting form letters, a number of form letters, and you know what form letters are. Somebody ran them off in Atlanta or somewhere, and everybody signs them and sends them, about equal from both sides. But I'm getting personal mail. I'm getting more personal mail from an not a pro-life choice, personally from Ms. Smith or Mr. Jones than I am. But the choice, the freedom of choice by far exceeds the pro-life, but most of those have been form letters, and you got to consider they were ran off in some place besides that person's den or living room. But it's an issue that's going to be complicated. It's an issue that's going to be terribly. It's far more than just, do you believe in abortion, yes or no? There's many other factors involved. You know, we're talking about monies for hospitals. Do we cut off all monies for hospitals that perform abortion? Do we abolish the rights of abortions in Georgia and let them go from Polk County 14 miles across the Alabama line to Piedmont and have it done, or Augusta to South Carolina, or Lafayette to Tennessee? There's a lot more ramifications to it. But it'll be settled, but it won't be very easy.
Right. As member of the House, you served under George T. Smith,
George L. Smith,
and Tom Murphy. How do you compare and contrast their leadership?
George L. Smith I served under, and George T. Smith, and then I left to go to the Senate as the Speaker was elected the first year as his term of Speaker. George L. Smith was very suave, very gentlemanly. George L. ran the House, controlled the House in an orderly, gentlemanly manner. He knew the rules. He was an expert and had expertise in all ramifications of the rules. And he was very polite. If George L. Smith had a problem with you, he would ask you to step into his office. And if it was a bad problem, everybody in the Capitol could hear the rumblings of the walls, but he did it in private. And then when you walked out and he walked out, it was over, done, and forgotten. That was the end of it. He lost his job. Of course, the Speaker then gained it through politics, but he lost it. Because when Carl Sanders came in as governor, George L. was the Speaker. And Carl Sanders said, as they did that in those days, but they cannot now, I want somebody else to be my Speaker. And he told George L. Smith that I want my Speaker, and he appointed George. He was elected, but he was appointed George T. Smith from Cairo, Grady County, to be his Speaker, and he served for 4 years. He then ran for lieutenant governor, was elected, ran for governor, was defeated, and now he is, as you well know, a member of the Supreme Court. George T. Smith, there was much difference as daylight and dark. George T. Smith could not run the House of Representatives. He didn't have the control of the House of Representatives because he was not elected as the membership. Remember, at that time, there's 220 members of the House. There's 180 now. It went from 220 to 205 to 200 now to 180. He could not control the House, even though he was the Speaker, because he didn't have the congeniality. He didn't have the rapport with the membership because he was not their Speaker. They didn't put him there. He didn't have his lieutenants out in the sitting out in the audience and sitting out in the House that could make decisions that carried on the rapport and carry on the congeniality of the House as George L. did. And George T. Smith lost control almost on a daily basis. We'd have to call a 20-minute recess or an hour recess, particularly with people like Denny Groover, who is a master, who is a terribly intelligent individual, attorney-wise, political-wise, astute-wise, and maneuverable-wise. And we would listen to him for a few minutes, shut the House down, and after 35 or 40 minutes of behind closed doors or with the interceding of Governor Sanders downstairs, Mr. Groover would withdraw and George T. would carry on about the business of the House. But a tremendous amount of difference in the two. And then he ran for lieutenant governor, and George L. came back, ran for Speaker again, and continued to do a good job. Then he passed away, and George, at that time, the members of the House had a Sunday morning meeting in Stone Mountain, as many as could be there, and made the decree that from this day forward we will run the House of Representatives. We will elect our people. No more will the governor of this state dictate to the membership and the electorate membership of this body. And at a breakfast at Stone Mountain, a decision was made to come back and to run our people and to take back over the House. George L. was elected Speaker. George Busby was elected Majority Leader. Tom Murphy was elected Pro Tem. And we came back and started running the House and said, no more will the governor do this. Well, George L. died. George Busbee had to make the decision as majority leader. Do I run for Speaker, knowing that Mr. Speaker today, Tom Murphy, was going to run because he was President Pro Tem, he almost had to. Or do I run for governor? And his wife, Mary Beth, came into Atlanta that day and the decision was made. And George L. is quoted as saying, you know, I can't practice law and be Speaker. And if I can't practice law, I might as well try to run for governor. And if I win, good. If I can't, I go back to Albany and start practicing law because as Speaker is going to necessitate almost full time. He made the decision to run for governor. Tom Murphy ran for Speaker, was overwhelmingly elected. As you know history, George Busbee was elected the governor, and both of them worked together for 8 years as governor and as Speaker, as close friends. They were very close friends because both of them held leadership positions for at least 4 years in the old house, and they were very close. But George Busbee went on to passed up being Speaker for a chance of being governor, and he was successful at it.
Let's go back
workhorse, not a show horse.
We go back to that meeting at Stone Mountain.
Yes, sir.
Who were the leaders that put that meeting together? And
Wayne Snow, Sloppy Floyd, myself, George Busbee, predominantly. And I shall never forget, it was very foggy. I drove in early that morning from Rockmart to Stone Mountain. It was very foggy. I won't ever forget that. And but Wayne Snow was active in it. George Busbee was active, very active in it. Mr. Speaker, Tom Murphy was very active in it. And they must have been 40 or 50 folks there that morning for the breakfast.
was there much opposition to what you were trying to do?
Not within that group. They may have been within the House. But I think predominantly most all the House members wanted to elect their own leadership and keep it out of the hands of the governor, because we had gone through 4 years of that. And in my tenure, in a history prior to that, because all governors had almost hand-named their own Speaker. And but the members of the House were very readily, I think, or the vast majority, to whether they were there at that breakfast or not, but let's go to something and elect our own people and stay away from what we've been doing in the past.
I think that's been a major change in the independence of the legislature.
Oh, it very much is. Prior to that time, if I may continue on that, prior to that time, the first bill introduced every year was House Bill 1, was appropriations. And the governor would introduce it, and nothing else was done then until House Bill 1 passed. And it was his bill, and he named, by his appointment of the Speaker, he named the chairman of the Appropriations Committee and its membership. And it was a rubber stamp. That was all. It was a fiasco. Everything was done exactly what the governor said. And we passed that appropriations bill and brought it back in just a matter of a few days. Then they continued on House Bill 2, 3, 4, 5, and on, etc. But nothing was done until the appropriation bill was passed. And the saying was then that you better not bother the appropriations bill, because that's the governor's bill. And that's the bill that he introduced. He runs for that right. But after we made some changes, and Sloppy Floyd became, under George L. Smith, became chairman of the Appropriations Committee with a new regime, and Sloppy came out with that hold the line. And it was, from that day forward, everybody knew that the Georgia General Assembly not only dictated its own leadership, House Bill 1 or whatever number it may possess, if the Appropriations Act belonged to the Georgia General Assembly and originated in the House, not in the governor's office. And we merely followed whatever the governor dictated by the bill, but we didn't follow his dictates throughout the bill. And it was changed drastically from that day forward, and the governor has a great amount of input, and I dare say even today, 80-85% of the appropriation bill he still controls or gets his wish in. But at least it goes to the General Assembly as if it belonged to them. But the governor still gets basically what he wanted overall through some, but at least he has to trade and compromise now. Before he didn't have to.
I see. I interrupted you before you got to Tom Murphy and his role.
Tom Murphy is a strong leader. Tom Murphy can look you in the eye. And I told somebody the other day in Cedartown Friday, for example, that Tom Murphy represented Haralson County and a portion of Polk County, but that's that's not so, and I went on to tell him, I have more respect than ever before now. Tom Murphy represents Georgia, and you look around the state, and there's many things that I think that have been good. Some people think that they're not, that we have today because of Tom Murphy. We have better university systems because he's an ardent supporter of the university systems. We have a World Trade Congress Center in Dalton, Georgia. We have the greatest institution. Atlanta is the World Congress Center. Without it, where would we be today? Atlanta would be not one of the greatest cities of the world when it comes to marketability of goods and services in the showplace. We wouldn't have that. We wouldn't have the Dome. It's going to be one of the greatest things that's ever happened in Georgia. We wouldn't have some major highway arteries. We wouldn't have some of the things in elementary and education as we do even in higher education if it were not for Tom Murphy. He's a strong leader. Tom Murphy is the type of individual that look you eye to eye, tell you where to go and how to get there, and won't pull any punches about it, and expects you to do the same thing. He expects reciprocity from you. Tom Murphy does not expect whimpering. Tom Murphy does not expect you to talk about him behind his back. If you got something to say it to him in the face, and it's over and done. But one thing Tom Murphy expects from everybody is something he delivers. Say what you got to say, but be truthful about it. And I have no disrespect for that. I can live with that. But Tom is a strong leader. He has mellowed dramatically in the last 2 or 3 years. He don't like to people think that, but I can see it. He don't give that as I'm as mean as I can be approach as he used to. But he can be mean when he wants to. He can compromise, he can trade, or he can take. Either one of the three. But Tom's a strong leader, and under the governors we've had while he's been Speaker, we needed that strong leadership. He's had close ties. He's had close ties with George Busby. He's had close ties with Joe Frank Harris. That's 16 years of close ties because he sat with them. He helped build the budget with George Busby. He helped build the budget with Joe Frank when Joe Frank was chairman of the appropriation. Tom appointed him to that position. There's a father-son of closeness there. But because of Tom's strong leadership in the House during these 16 years of these two administrations, Georgia has fared much better because the governor has had his input, his learnedness, and his expertise in the appropriations in the budgetary process. But Tom Murphy has helped him, do things in this state and other parts of the state that he hadn't even done for his own hometown oftentimes. And if anything's got him in trouble, it's been that. He's worked so hard for other areas for Georgia. And maybe it's a time or two there he forgot his hometown, but politically, he's built Congress centers in Atlanta and trade marts in Dalton, and you might ask why not Bremen, but he represents Bremen and does it very well.
The Atlanta Journal-Constitution seemed to argue that the Senate is operated more democratically than the House. What's your experience?
I agree with that. If nothing else, by virtue of numbers. In the House with 180 members, you must figure you got to have 91 to do anything. On the Constitutional Amendment, even more than that, 136 or 37 on it. But you got to have 91 for majority to pass anything. And in our body, it takes 29, and that's a third less going in than it takes in the House. And then in the House, there's no way you can take 180 members and the leadership explain and expand to every one of them what's going on. The sad part of the House of Representatives is that oftentimes members stay there all year and never really have any input and never really know what's going on. And it's not because they don't want to, it's just because there is not enough time. You meet 40 days on 40 nights, and to introduce an appropriations bill or any other piece of major legislation, whether it's growth strategies or QBE, and explain that to 179 members because the speaker's presiding, and really get down one-on-one is an impossibility. So if that one member wants to become informed, he or she must go to all the committee meetings, of which they don't have time, because time's so important. They're doing something else, tending to constituencies, tending to the committees they're on or their own business. So they don't have time to go to appropriations or education meetings. Then it comes back to the floor, and it's explained by the author or the governor's floor leader or the majority leader, and he explains what he wants you to know. Oftentimes not what's in the legislation, but by what he wants you to know. And if you haven't read it or had a grasp of it, and a very few of them is going to read a 160 or 70 page bill anyway. So the time is there, but they don't have time to go through it. They pass it and go on about their business, and perhaps there wasn't but 7 or 8, maybe 12 or 14, maybe 15 at the most knew what it does or what's in it.
You're saying there's not many Denmark Groovers in the house.
That's exactly right. Who does his homework at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, underlines and makes red X's and asks himself questions on the side on the index, and he's ready for you the next day, even though he hadn't been to committee meeting. There's not many of those people in the House. No, there's not. And I don't say that to play down the other members of the House. I say that to place him upward because he's unusual. But now, see, in the Senate, you have more time. You know, of the 56 members, let's say 25 or 27 of us are on appropriations. That takes in over 50% almost in the beginning. And the others have input in that we have all type of open meetings that they have time, 2 at a time, 3 at a time, 4 at a time to come before. And you're meeting the same length of time as the House is, and so everybody can participate, or the leadership has an opportunity to meet with every one of them. We'll have a breakfast and have everybody there. You can't have a breakfast or a luncheon or a meeting in the House and have everybody there. We can brief them rather easily, and you have more input because you got more time. You got more availability of time and personnel in the Senate to become a player. So therefore, it's from a democratic standpoint, if you mean democratic in that everybody participate, in the Senate it's more readily accessible, it's easier by less constraints of population. And that's the biggest answer, is that we have the same legal advice and the same services that the House does, and they do it 1 to 3, where in the House they may be 1 to 43. So we have more availability of budgetary officers and legal advisors on a smaller scale to stay with us all day and all night, and we just have greater input. But the simple reason is it's numbers and nothing else.
What about the appointment of committees? Does the Lieutenant Governor
Yes.
name the people?
The Lieutenant Governor names the committees, as does the Speaker. The Lieutenant Governor tried 8 years ago to set up a committee on committees, the President pro tempore and the Majority Leader, and that lasted for 4 years, and Lieutenant Governor sought it back and got the power back. It was a tremendous amount of power, awesome amount of power to give away, but he thought that it was the most democratic thing to do is let everybody participate, and he anyway wanted to correct it and did correct it, and now he appoints, the Lieutenant Governor appoints all committees, and the Speaker appoints all committees in the House, and they can be appointed for many reasons. Seniority can be a basis, knowledge can be a basis, politics can be a major basis in both bodies. Those are the criteria. In the House, you know, the Speaker runs every time unopposed, but in the Senate, the Lieutenant Governor runs every 4 years, and oftentimes you can change in that 4 years by, you didn't help him last time and you help him more this time. And he's human, and I think he tries to remember. But and he tries to appoint by the intelligence of the subject, the motivation of the subject, and the request of the subject as to where he places you.
You've had a good relationship with Zell Miller, haven't you?
Yes, yes. We've been up and down the elevator together. Zell and I are very close. Zell has been an outstanding Lieutenant Governor. He's done a fine job and will complete this term, 16 years, is unheralded as Lieutenant Governor anyway. But he will have completed 16 years. I think, being a Lieutenant Governor, you can get out of it what you want to. You can preside for 40 days and go home. You can preside for 40 days and spend the rest of the time in your office, or you can spend 40 days presiding and become a part of all the entity of the government. You can be a part of each piece of legislation. You can lend your fingerprint and imprint on it just as the governor has or the Speaker has. And Zell did not choose to do that for 8 years. For the past 8 years, and particularly the past 5 years, Zell, Lieutenant Governor Miller, has attempted to put his mark on legislation. He supported Governor Harris in the 8 years or 7 years thus far he's been there, closer than anybody I know. But he's tried to leave his footprints in the sand on legislation just like the governor has. The first 2 terms of his office, he did not try that. He merely presided and let it go its way, particularly the 8 years at George Busbee. He did not get involved with legislation. He did not get involved with anything except procedural of running the Senate, and that was the end of his tenure on that particular day. But in the last 5, 6 years with the Governor Harris, he's become involved, he's become a partner, and he's demanded that issues be discussed with him as it always has been his counterpart in the House. And it's worked out well for both bodies.
Why did he change?
I think he saw times passing him by. I think he saw that history was no longer recorded. He stood there with a gavel in his hand for 16 years and done absolutely nothing. And he'd become involved with, and maybe because when he took the job the first time as lieutenant governor, he thought that's what he's supposed to do. I'm just president of the Senate. I'm not involved in the executive branch. I'm not even involved in the legislative branch. I just stand here and preside. I'm elected statewide as the speaker is elected by his constituents to represent his House district first. The lieutenant governor is not, so he had no obligation except to Georgia, and that was to preside. And I think he saw time passing him by and the sands washing away, and he had no footprints, and he wanted somebody to remember some things he had done, so he began to get involved in the educational process, the educational budget, the university budget, the DOT budget. And each budget now that goes out of there, you can see some of his fingerprints on. And legislation, both major in the House and the Senate, passes or does not pass. You see Zell Miller's handiwork involved. And I think it's been better for Georgia to have lent some credence and some expertise for him in it as it did the members of the Senate.
In recent years, there have been a number of times when Zell Miller and Tom Murphy have disagreed. Do you feel there are differences or just personal or philosophical, or is it inevitable that there would be a difference between the House and Senate?
I think all three of your statements, four if you classify the last one as two-fold, are true. I think there's a philosophical difference in that one represents really and truly 18 to 19,000 people. The speaker, that's all he represents, is one House district. All he is obligated to is 18,000 or whatever the mean is on the House districts. Whereas Zell Miller, the lieutenant governor, is obligated to the same number of people that the governor is. He may feel that the people of Atlanta are far different. The biggest box in this state is far different than the people of Haralson County may be from a philosophical view, so he takes an opposite view. There's also a difference in the leadership of one represents Georgia and feel that they must be differently than the one who does not. His leadership ability is the strength, knowingly and seeingly, the strength of Zell Miller is not from the podium, as oftentimes it must be with the Speaker of the House when you're dictating to 179 people on sit down, be quiet, all of those things, carrying out the rules of the order. It's not that bad in the Senate with 56 as it is with 179 with the confusions that could exist if the Speaker did not dictate otherwise. But they have a philosophical difference. They have a difference in leadership styles. I guess sometimes it would be personal on, this is my turf. That's the governor none of them messing with his business, whoever the governor happens to be. No more than members of the Senate and want House members messing with theirs or vice versa. But oftentimes it gets personal. And it gets personal after it once has been philosophical or a leadership difference. And the anxieties of the day may transcend to the next week and the next week. And after a while it will become personal, as humans will have that thing done to them. But I think both of them handle themselves well. I don't think Georgia has suffered because of the conflicts of the House and the Senate. I think Georgia may very well have prospered. And the perfect example of that would have been the sales tax of this year. The Lieutenant Governor wanted a full elimination of sales tax off all foods. Well, the House saying we do not have that type of money to give back to the people. And if we're going to raise the sales tax, if we don't put it on foods, we're going to have to raise it again next year, and we won't buy that. And the governor says, I got to have more money if I'm going to build developmental highways as I want to in education. And the compromise was that Zell Miller won. We got the Senate version. We got sales tax. We got it off $180 million worth of foodstuffs. But the effective date is 1990, October 1st of 1990, rather than the day the bill went into effect was April 1st of 89. We gave ourselves 2 months of extra time collecting sales tax. Normally it wouldn't have went into effect, until July 1st. But it went into effect April 1st and gave us 2 months to carry over some extra money for this year. But the compromise was that we won, Zell Miller won in that he got deductions on $180 million worth of foodstuffs. The House won, Speaker won, in that it turned out to be not Zell Miller's plan, but it turned out to be Joe Frank Harris's plan, thus eliminated the personal conflict between the two as to whose turfdom won, the House bill, the Senate bill. As it was Joe Frank Harris's late night maneuver of writing down misspelled words on a sheet of paper and passing the canned stuff versus the foodstuffs and eliminating the canned stuffs. But anyway, it was a compromise that Georgia may very well have won the war, and nobody lost the battle. But there was a personality conflict there based upon who believed in what for the next year of not having to raise taxes, and it turned out that they got over it, and I think we went home with its final piece of legislation, and I think '89 will be one of the greatest years we've ever had in the General Assembly.
Let's go back to your early career. Let's see, Governor Sanders was in office
When I was elected,
when
yes.
you first came to the legislature. Did you support all of his programs?
No. It's ironical, and it's a little humorous story. The first piece of legislation, of major legislation that was introduced, as I said earlier, is always the appropriations bill. And Mr. Fowler and Mr. Groover and came up with a appropriations bill of their own. And the first major piece of legislation I voted on was appropriations bill, and at that time Carl Sanders had 3 floor leaders. South Georgia was George Busby, Middle Georgia with Arthur Bolton, and North Georgia with Jim Andrews from Northeast Georgia and Toccoa. And that was his 3 floor leaders. And they explained the bill, and Mr. Fowler from Douglasville, who went on to be Public Service Commissioner, explained their substitute. And then this bill, then the budget was just several $100 million, and now it's $7.5 billion. They saved Georgia $25 or $30 million and convinced me that that's the way it ought to go. Nobody explained to me the rules of that's the governor's bill and you go with it or nothing else. And anyway, I voted with Mr. Fowler and Mr. Groover and got about 22 votes out of 220. And I didn't know any better, and everybody started looking at me and staring at me, but I made I thought was right. If it was a mistake, it was not a mistake. I was trying to save taxpayers $18-20 million. But the funny thing about it was the gentleman who sat directly behind me, James H. Sloppy Floyd, from Tryon, and he sat behind me and he punched me and he said, Nathan, I don't want to tend to your business, but I want to tell you something. Always, because what you have just done was a bad mistake. You always vote with the governor on the appropriations bill. Don't never vote against the appropriations bill, because that's his bill and that's the only thing he really cares about. And if you vote for that, you don't have to worry about anything else. And that's his right to set the appropriations any way he wants to in this state. And the funny part with that is, after he got to be chairman of the appropriations, it was just absolutely the opposite. It was his bill, his appropriations, and the governor could come to him if anything he wanted to do, but it just took on a different view after he got to be appropriations. And he meant it in the greatest of sincerity after he got to be chairman, and he was doing it from a House of Representatives that was free from the governor and had freedom from the governor. But that was the biggest, and that was my first major vote as a freshman in the Georgia House of Representatives. But Carl Sanders sent several people to see me. Mr. W.D. Tripp came to my hotel that night. He was superintendent of banks, and he came to see me that night and informed me that the governor had called him and wanted to know what in the world was going on. And he explained it to me very, very nicely after about 30 minutes. And the next day I had many other people from Polk County either came to see me or called me to want to know what in the world it had done and what was I trying to do. So I went to see the governor, the first time I'd ever been in the governor's office, to talk to the governor and explain to him, and told him that it was an honest mistake and we understood each other and we were very good friends for 4 years. And then Jimmy Carter came along, and some of the things that we had was reorganization, and I opposed him on particularly one. I went with him down the line on all the reorganization. We came to the Department of Human Resources, and there's some parties in that he wanted to trade and to split up, and some he wanted to put together. And I had some money in the budget, and it was $36,000, to build a pavilion behind the State Patrol Barracks in Cedartown. They didn't have a place. The State Patrol Barracks in Cedartown was very, very small, and you go in there to get licensed, and they just didn't have enough room. So I wanted to build, and it's still there today, the pavilion behind it, and a place to get your driver's license. And I had $36,000 in the budget to do that. And President Carter called me down and wanted to know if I'd made up my mind about voting with him on the restructuring of human resources. And I told him, I said, Governor, I don't know. He said, let me know in the morning. So the next morning he called me, and I went down and I said, Governor, I made up my mind. I've talked to people in Polk County, particularly those who work with the department, and they don't want it done. I can't vote with you. He said, very well. And he opened his desk drawer and pulled up the budget and says, I see here you have $36,000 for a project in Polk County. And he said, Nathan, if I lose your vote, you lose your money. And he kept a man of his word. I voted against him and I lost my money. And that was the first line item veto by a governor. And take money out of the Appropriations Act. Nobody knew you could until he took my $36,000 out. But George Busby started running, and he remembered it because he took some of his out also. And I shall never forget, George Busby said, Nathan, if I'm elected, I'm going to give you your money back. You have my word on it. And he kept his word. He gave me, we got $42,000 back to build a pavilion in the office there at the patrol station where Mr. Carter took out my $36,000 the previous year.
But otherwise, you were compatible with Carter's program.
Yes.
Have you had any real difficulties with any of the governors? Any basic disagreements?
No, not other than maybe a piece of legislation. You know, Joe Frank and I, for 8 years, have been very, very close. I've supported him. I walked the streets for him. I worked for him and made speeches, many, many speeches in his behalf when he couldn't go as he ran. You know, we have a closeness. I was born on Wingfoot Street in Rockmart. Joe Frank was born on Wingfoot Street in Goodyear. His father worked in the Goodyear mill, and so did mine. And we grew up, you know, baseballing and footballing and scouting and all of that together, from one Goodyear plant to the other. And but we've known each other. We played in sports in high school. But anyway, and as governor, if he and I had something we didn't agree on, you know, I was floor leader for him for 3 years. And if there's something that we disagreed on, that we tried to work it out, and worked it out before the legislation was ever passed, because with him I've had an opportunity to help draft legislation, and I have some input into it before it's introduced. And if not, I have input into it either on committee or rules or doing something to make it more compatible. But I haven't had any problems other than those two, and both of those I think are more humorous than anything else, of any major problems on any major legislation that a governor introduced.
Do you view your role as a senator primarily as a spokesman or representative of your district, and as a person to make sure that the district gets its fair share of the rewards? Or do you believe your role is primarily that of passing laws for the state at large?
It can be the greater part of the former and some of the latter. I believe that I'm responsible as far as passing legislation is concerned. I believe I am responsible for passing the very best that Georgia can have. And if it's the very best that Georgia can have, it will also be the best my district can have, whether it's education or whatever, or quality basic education, or growth strategies, or soil and water sedimentation, or water reservoirs. If it's best for Georgia, predominantly most time it'll be best for my district. If not, it can be added to or taken away. I'm a spokesman for the people of my district. I represent primarily the people of my district. But in doing so, that which I vote upon, I must oftentimes look upon as what's best for Georgia and try to make them both compatible. But I go to the General Assembly to try to return to my district all that I can to get the victor goes the spoils, or to get back as much of the tax dollars we spend as I possibly can for our district. But at the same time, I must also represent Georgia. If each one of us represent only our district and do nothing else for Georgia, we'll be lagging behind. Because oftentimes, many pieces of legislation that have no direct effect for my district per se, that I think, but I vote for it because it's best for Georgia, as it turns out it may be something relative to tourism. But that's an avenue we can open up and do something about in my district. So it may take years to enhance us, but it will eventually someday. It may be something relative to textile, or it may be something relative to timberlands. Timberland is not as abundant here as they are in South Georgia. But if I can help the timberland owners or the timber producers or the paper pulp producers do something better, that means they can enlarge a plant. That means they can hire more people. That means they pay more taxes. That means next year I got more money in the state treasury that I can do something more for my people back home, even though we don't have much paper and pulp. We have one in Florida and that's it. Paper and pulp areas in my district. So what I can do for them can come back to help me also in my district down the road to come.
Looking back over your lengthy career, what legislation do you consider your most important contribution?
Quality basic education. I think quality basic education was the greatest piece of legislation that we've passed in this state. I think in 1999, when the first graduating class goes out of the schools, we like one more year under Joe Frank Harris, and we like about $133 million having completely funded it. If we can do the things statewide and locally that QBE tells us that we ought to do, I think quality basic education will be the greatest piece of legislation that we have passed in 25 years in the Georgia General Assembly. And this year, the greatest piece that will even almost be comparable to that was enhancement and enlivenment of quality basic as far as growth strategies is concerned, and gives to the people back home a new way of life from a sedimentation and soil erosion and water reservoirs and preservation of our drinking water and our water sewage for many years to come. It's given us a land use based planning for Georgia that we've never had before locally, and we've never had that before. And you either participate or there's an absence of grants, the old carrot approach, but if that's the only way you can get their attention, I guess that's what you have to do. But it's something that we can turn the new century and we can go into the 21st century with those two pieces of legislation, one for education and one for a quality way of life. And I think that the years to come we'll see the two tied together. Georgia won't be the Empire State of the South. It won't be the hub of the South. We can be the Empire State of the United States. We're fifth now in economic development. We're eighth in growth of manpower and job opportunity. We could be first by the year 2000 with these two pieces of legislation.
Senator Dean, you've served under a lot of different governors. Would you rank them in effectiveness?
I think number one would be Joe Frank Harris. Joe Frank Harris served 16 years as a member of the House of Representatives. And they knew him and he knew them. And as during this tenure of 8 years as appropriations chairman, and very close to the Speaker, and the Speaker gave him many leadership roles. And he exemplified this leadership in an admirable manner, and it transcended over into the governor's office. I think that because of that, I think that Joe Frank Harris, after having gotten through his first year, has become the governor, the best one that I have served with. And that's not because we're closer than any of the rest of them. I just think he's been closer to the members of the General Assembly than any of the rest of them. And the next one would be George Busby. And I think some of the same reasons. He served there and he's close to everybody and he knew what was going on and he gave you an opportunity to be a part of what was going on. And the third one would be Carl Sanders. Carl Sanders came, he served in the Senate. He served very unusual. He served one term, and that was supposed to have been it from Richmond County, Augusta, and it's supposed to have then gone over to someone else, and they backed off and let him have their term. That county gave up and let Carl Sanders run again from his county, and that's giving him 4 years in the Senate. And then while he was campaigning, everything was changed, but he was elected that year. Carl Sanders started out running for lieutenant governor, and somewhere in the middle of his term changed his mind and said, I'm going to run for lieutenant governor. Let's go on and run for governor, Marvin Griffin. And he ran for governor and was elected, as you well know, and was a good governor. He did more for education in that 4 years. That was his theme. He came in and did a tremendous amount for education that we needed to be done. Georgia has always been isolated and terrible in education. Dollars spent and rules, regulations, and all that amount that ought to have been done for education. And last has been Jimmy Carter. I think he tried, but Governor Maddox was lieutenant governor, and there was between the two, and between George T. as Speaker of the House and Governor Maddox And so many people, when Governor Carter got to reorganizing the government itself, he lost a great number of the members of the General Assembly. He lost a lot of department heads and lost help from his own inside of his own circles from department heads, because they knew their job was abolished. They were gone. Their people were gone. And for 4 years that Jimmy Carter possibly could have been a great governor, he never got to excel because he didn't have the people. He didn't have the Senate support. He didn't have Lester Maddox support. It was every day, very doggedly he had to perform. He did not have the members of the House. He did not have his own, as I said earlier, department heads to carry it out. And I think that all of those things made his 4 years not the best 4 years he could have had in Georgia.
Mm-hmm. Well, you've been in government for nearly 30 years now. If you had the power to change Georgia's government in any way, what changes would you make?
Reapportionment. I would 180 members of the House is too many members. I would make it reduce the size of both bodies. I would streamline it and I would lengthen the tenure from just 40 days and 40 nights of trying to cram something into it. I would make it from a professional standpoint once you lower it with more staff, more office space, more capabilities of doing your job, of giving you advice and counseling and doing for you the things that need to be done back home. Of course, with all of this, it becomes more expensive, but you get what you pay for. But I would do those things. I would try to curtail it and streamline the both legislative bodies by elimination of some of the slots and enhance the capabilities of each member. I would lengthen the session. In the Senate, I would let you pre-file legislation. I would let the appropriations work constantly throughout the time rather than just on that one bill, and that's the end of it. From a legislative standpoint, those are the greatest things that I can think of that need to be done. But at the same time, when you do those things, those in the power and authority lose some power and authority, because you got people working full time and they become almost as strong as you are, and they're down there when you're down there, where today they're not down there while you're down there. So from a power standpoint, you lose some of it, but it strengthens, I believe, the legislative process and gives the people back home a better view and more input into it, rather than trying to do it all in the few days that we do it in. And most of it's done in the last 4 days anyway. I don't care how many days you stay prior to the last 4 days.
Would you change the office of Lieutenant Governor in any way?
No. There's some things that he could do. You know, you could make him Director of Industry and Trade to give the Lieutenant Governor something to do when he's not presiding. He presides for 40 days, and then he's on his own the rest of the time. And oftentimes he never sees the governor 2 or 3 times a year after the session's over. He may meet with the governor on maybe a disaster occur, or the governor needs him for some kind of council or committee meeting. He may meet with him for a few minutes, but other than that, he never participates. You know, there's those that might even say that it would be better if the governor and lieutenant governor ran together as a team, and they both served the same cause, and they both served the same constituency, and they both served for the same legislature. But if not, there's something ought to be more meaningful for the lieutenant governor than just to preside for 40 days and he's through with government. You never hear of him or see of him. But as I said previously, Zell Miller in the last 5 or 6 years has tried to become more involved. You see him traveling all over the state. You hear him all over the state. He's been national president of the Council of Lieutenant Governors. He's trying to put his footprints in the sand. But there still be other things that he can do, whether it's work with industry and trade to recruit or work more closely with the governor. But oftentimes the governors become, this is my turf, and I don't say there's jealousy, but this is my old turfdom edict, and they don't want them working with them. So that eliminates the thoughts maybe of running as a team and running together. But the speaker works more in the off session in most cases than does the lieutenant governor, particularly the first 6, 7 years or 8 years of the present lieutenant governor's office. But in the last 6, 7 years, Zell Miller has attempted to do a lot more than ever been done before in the history. Prior to that, you never saw the lieutenant governor other than just that 40 days and 40 nights, and nobody knew. He went back home, practiced law, whatever he wanted to do, and that's wrong. but we've got the salary now commensurate. The lieutenant governor makes $59,000 a year, and that ought to be a full-time job, and Zell Miller's attempted to make it a full-time job. But there's still other things that he could do during the off session to help the state of Georgia, whether it's a chairman of some major committee or major department head working in conjunction, industry, trade, tourism, or whatever it happens to be. But I think the governor would think if you make him head of that, you have lost my input. He becomes the hero and not me. So whatever is done will have to satisfy all parties.
In recent years, we've seen the legislature change with the addition of more women, more blacks, and a growing Republican Party. Do you see Georgia becoming a two-party state, or it will
Yes.
continue to be a Democratic state?
Oh, no. Georgia is rapidly becoming a two-party state, and where it becomes a two-party state, first is on the local level. And you have 5 major metropolitan counties today that are predominantly Republican. Chairman, county boards, all Republican. And every day you pick up the paper, another commissioner in one of the 15, 16 metropolitan counties, ARC-type counties, has had a press conference and changed his allegiance to one party from the Democrat to Republican on a local level. And that's rapidly growing. The influence there on a local level is growing. In Cobb County, as large as it is, they have one Republican House member. And I think he's in the district that he's got to make a decision rapidly and hope that he can run for the Senate to pick up more Democratic strength on the west part of the county to run for a senator seat who is vacating it and running for a higher office. Gwinnett County's changed to Clayton County, Cobb. You have 5 major counties. And that's swinging out into other areas. And you major concerns that are moving into the metropolitan area are bringing 5, 10, 15, 25 to 100 people a day into the areas. And that's a lot of people. And predominantly they're coming from Republican strongholds, and they are coming in as Republicans. And today you can run in a county of one of just 5 that are major in the metropolitan area, and when you announce today, you pick up 45 to 46 to 47% of the strength of the population in those areas. So you've got to run as Republican to be elected. You've only got to get 5 or 6% on your own, where it's that way now in my area, in the opposite, in some other areas in the opposite, but where the people are in the metropolitan area, they're rapidly becoming Republican. But to be Republican in the General Assembly today, there's nothing until all of it changes. To be Republican from this area, either in the House or the Senate, if you want to bring home the bacon, quote, end quote, there's not any to bring home, because they're not going to let you have it. You just have a seat, and that's about all you do. You get to vote on legislation. You can vote green or red, but you have no input unless you want to speak on a bill. You have no input relative to writing it or producing it or carrying it forward. You have no input on the appropriational process, budgetary process, and it's very slim the pickings that you get to bring home. But in the metropolitan areas, they aren't used to anybody bringing those things home anyway. They don't get the things we get. What they get, big government gives them anyway. DOT builds a bridge, DOT builds a 4-lane, or DHR builds a mental health, mental retardation center, and it's done automatically out of Atlanta. It's not done through the lawmaking process. More and more county commissioners in those areas now being elected as Republicans, more mayors, and more, particularly in cities, are elected as Republicans because they have nonpartisan primaries, and you don't know what they are until after they're voted on. And most of the big, the city elections are nonpartisan. But inevitably, the victor is a Republican, but he didn't have to proclaim because they don't have that as a statute within the city election. But the blacks are changing, the women are changing, and all these things are being brought about because of the influx of the people into the metropolitan areas. In the 91 new election, after the 90 census, is even going to add more credentials to all 3 of those. Republicans, blacks, and females. And there's nothing wrong with that in the General Assembly. There's nothing wrong with people being represented, and if they come from those districts, those people ought to represent those districts. I have no quarrel with that.
One last question. I know you've been a lifetime Democrat. What is your relationship to the National Democratic Party?
Like most people in Georgia, slim, dim, and far away. The people in my district, the people in my counties that I represent, and the people in the General Assembly have never been included in the National Democratic Party. The people that run on the National Democratic Party are elected with no more the thinking of Georgians on a national level than nothing. There's no consultation. There is no togetherness. What they think in the old days of that's what gets you elected because that's what New York wants, California wants, and maybe 4 or 5 other states. Well, they found out now that even those states don't want those. If you check the last two, when you get beat 49-1 and 48-2, I'm talking about state-wise, even those states don't want all the social type programs that Democrats have always thought they had to produce on a national level. And some of the candidates with their thinking and their style and their brand and you know, it's sometimes paradoxical in that we can always elect the controlling majority of Congress, but once they get to Congress, they stay as far away from the presidential environment as they possibly can. They come back and they're Georgia Democrats and not a national Democrat, but they were elected on the same day that president was elected, the Republican president in most cases, and at least the last, 4 or 5, and, well, the last 4, counting the 2 terms and this term. But the National Democratic Party is not in touch with my district. And maybe I owe them something. I ought to start trying to get more in touch with them. But they do not converse with the local folks anymore. We have no voice in that situation. We have no voice in the National Democratic Party, and only a certain few. And that certain few can't ever be elected. I am a Democrat, and have been, like my father before, and on and on. But I have nothing to do with the National Democratic Party, as does none of the rest of the members of the General Assembly per se. I represent this section as a Democrat in the Georgia General Assembly, and as Buddy Darden does, the 7th District, or as Congressman Newt Gingrich does, Republicans in Washington. And we, I think, have been successful in keeping it that way. But there's a great difference in Washington and Atlanta, philosophically, workability, and yes, even sometimes talent-wise. But the Republicans and the Democrats have ran totally different personalities. The last 3 times, twice with Mr. Reagan and once the last time with Mr. Bush, and I think the results of all 3 elections ought to have taught the National Democratic Party something out there somewhere. And I think now with Mr. Brown, who is going to do, I think, a better job with the Democrats and the Republicans, Mr. Atwater he's already out there doing the same thing for his side of the fence. But it's hard sometimes to run, as I did this last time. It's hard to explain to people what's going on in Washington. You got to get them back down home, and if you keep the secret of the success of that, if you can keep them back home, you'll never be interfered with nor involved with the National Democratic Party. And that's what we've attempted to do, and have apparently been successful the last 4 or 5 elections, is keep it on a local plane and an even plane of what I can do for you in Atlanta. You need to talk to somebody else about, well, you know, about what's going on in Washington.
Senator Dean, I really appreciate this interview. You've been very frank and very helpful.
Thank you.